Hello, all. I'm King John. You're awesome. And I'd like to take a little time to talk to you about the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you're unfamiliar with it, in the late 1800s, Chinese immigration to the USA was a big deal, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed to prevent any Chinese people from immigrating to the USA. Now, most people who talk about this will tell you is because America will hold this up as an example of America being racist. But that's at best an oversimplification and at worst an outright falsehood. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't people involved who were racist. I'm not saying there weren't people involved who did not like Chinese people. But that's not the reason for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, there are people from a somewhat different political bent who will say other things about it that also don't make sense. For example, some people have said that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed because there was a cholera epidemic in China at the time, which isn't actually true. There wasn't a cholera epidemic in China at the time. There were some people in America who thought there was, but likewise, and that was not the reason for the Chinese Exclusion Act. The actual reason for the Chinese Exclusion Act is pretty simple, but it requires a little context to understand. See, at the time, travel by sea was faster, cheaper, and easier than travel by land. Even early railroads didn't change that. So, for a very long time, it was a lot easier for people to move from China and the rest of East Asia to the western coast of the USA than it was for people from just about anywhere else, including the rest of the country. So it was very easy to foresee at the time that if Chinese immigration was not forestalled, then Chinese people would very quickly become a majority of people in the western coast of the USA, whereas the rest of the USA was almost entirely people of European descent. Now, that would have been a problem because throughout all of history, anytime there's been that kind of ethnic divide inside of a country, the result has been civil conflict. With very few exceptions. Very few exceptions. Now, obviously, people in America didn't want to have a civil conflict. Now, looking back at things from our perspective, we have an extra 150 years perspective, more than the people did back then. So, looking back 150 years, I think we can say that there was less of an actual risk of that than maybe the people at the time thought. Maybe. America is a very flawed country, but compared to the rest of the world, it actually handled interethnic relations fairly well. Now, like I said, we have this extra perspective that people at the time did not have. There's one other thing that's very important to remember. Well, more than one thing. One thing, but I get into one thing that's very important to remember, and that is that every American voter, every man in Congress, the president who signed the bill into law, every single person involved had just lived through the American Civil War. And so, just the thought of the risk of another conflict like that was enough to drive a lot of people to do things that they otherwise would never do. Even things they thought were dishonorable, things they thought were wrong. And that is very important to remember as well. Because It's not that people were so racist, they so hated Chinese, they thought this was right, they thought this was okay. They thought it was wrong. They knew it was racist. They didn't like it. President Arthur, who signed the bill into law, who signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law, he specifically said he thought this was wrong. He thought this was dishonorable. He thought it was awful. They shouldn't do it, but he thought it was necessary. And if you actually look at what people were writing about it and saying about it at the time, the vast majority of everybody agreed with him. They thought it was bad, wrong. A lot was all kinds of things bad about it, but they could not bear the risk. Now, like I said, looking back 150 years, we might disagree with that, but we're not the ones who had to make that decision. The men who were there at that time and place were the ones who had to make that decision. And for better or worse, they made the decision that they thought was necessary to make. And that is why the Chinese Exclusion Act happened. Now, praise God that we've moved past that, and things like that have not happened well for a long time since. And I think the country is better. I think the world is better than it used to be. But it is important to remember what happened before and also why things happened before. And this is one thing that I think is worth remembering and talking about. So thank you for watching. Please comment and tell me what anything that you have to say about this. I'd really like to know what you think. And I hope you have a lovely day, and God bless.